over here.
Levi, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Perfect. All right. With that, awesome. Let's get started. Actually, before we start, it looks like Carlos, you had one in particular that you wanted to go over.
Yeah, I posted the link in the chat.
941. Okay.
And
this one.
The comment is at the bottom.
We'll zoom in. Okay.
So the last time I requested an amend to this API proposal was to make one of the constructors public. Is the one that simply received the handle. That one is currently used in framework for the methods called create from new and creator open. But I realized that I'm also going to need to make another constructor public if I want to implement create from file, because this constructor receives a handle, a file stream, and a Boolean saying if we need to leave it open. And since we want to keep the same behavior, well, I'm going to need to make this constructor public too. So, oh, and also on my previous request, I talked about making some object security classes, adding them, but I realized they are not necessary. So, yeah, we can ignore that.
So is this it, Carlos?
Yes, this is the one.
No, I mean, is this the last thing?
I hope so.
So please don't come another time unless it's the last time.
Okay.
Sorry, you were saying make this particular constructor public. Were we also reverting a previous change that we did? Or is this the only thing remaining just to make this one thing public?
This is the last. Can you repeat that question?
So you had said that you wanted to make this particular constructor public. Was there another API that we previously made public that you want to revert back to private?
No.
Okay. I must have misheard you earlier then. Okay.
Yeah, so we already made one constructor public, which is the one that receives just the handle. And now I'm going to need the other constructor to be made public, which receives the 3 arguments, the handle, the file stream, and the Boolean. And that should be it.
And is that actually the correct constructor to be public? Like, I know it's being called now, but is that the correct public experience, or the only way it could be written?
Yeah, well, if we want to keep the same behavior as in framework, for create from file, we actually need to pass the 3 arguments. We are creating the memory mapped file from scratch in that method. Because in the other 2 methods, create new and creator open, we're assuming that we only need to pass a handle.
What does it mean to pass both a memmap handle and a file stream to this?
They get assigned. They get saved internally. Here's the thing. Let me open it.
Sure. Feel free to share your screen too, if you need to.
Right.
So my problem is I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around why the constructor would need both.
Well, the file handle is different from the file mapping handle, right? Because you have to call create file mapping. Is that what the safe handle is being passed in?
Yeah. So it seems that this is related to leaving it open, leaving the stream open or not. Would you like me to come with more details about this? I'm not 100% sure what would be the implications.
Right. The point is, like, while that's currently the constructor that was convenient for the person who wrote the functionality, it wasn't public. And so it's making it public. There become all sorts of questions. Does the file stream have to be positioned appropriately, et cetera? Versus if the callers, which I'm looking at one right now, which is create from file, it doesn't take a file stream. So maybe we want a constructor that takes similar arguments and we move the file stream creation into that constructor. Like, this isn't just because it was being called, it needs to be made public. This is because you're exposing something, it needs to be the right thing.
Okay.
And would it, I'm wondering also if it would be, because this scenario was possible in .NET Framework, correct? It was just done differently, is that right?
The scenario exists in Framework, yes.
So I think it'd be really helpful for me to see what the .NET Framework consumption code looked like for what the user wrote against .NET Framework to pull off this scenario, and then compare that with the code that we would write against .NET Core for doing this. I don't know if it would help anybody else, but that would help me.
I see. Sure, I can share it now.
Sure, go ahead.
Maps file. Create from file. Okay, create from. Okay, got it. It's in the chat.
Can I actually pull up the chat here? Let's see here. Reference source memory map file 181. So this thing, that's the call right there that you had highlighted, right?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm late. This is about, we're talking about memory map file stuff and exposing another constructor.
Is someone trying to speak?
Sounds like Steven.
Yeah, Steve, you're at the end of a very long tunnel.
Oh, sorry.
Right, so Carlos, this is the call that's calling it, but this isn't the user code. The user code is they would call the public method that this has. So the user's not passing a file stream. They're passing the arguments that we're going to use to open the file stream. And so that's my question.
So
do we want to move like half of the work of this method into a new constructor? Do we want to make this whole method be a constructor and the method just forwards into it? Like, this is what we need to decide before making something public.
Yeah, we definitely should not make that constructor at the bottom public.
Yeah, Carlos, what scenario would a user be creating the file mapping themselves? Because they would have to p-invoke and everything like that, right? How are you imagining this new constructor getting called?
This is dependent on the API that was approved. Specifically the one that Jeremy wrote in the initial proposal, because we're passing a file stream. So can I get more details on why this should not be made public?
Well, generally speaking, when you have a constructor like this that takes multiple different types of handles, in this case, a memory mapped file handle and a regular file handle, generally speaking, that's an internal implementation detail of the type that's being constructed. For instance, does memory mapped file, like does the memory mapped file class have a property that exposes the underlying file stream? If not, then it sounds like the file stream isn't actually intended to be a public implementation detail of the memory mapped file itself.
It's not intended to be an implementation, a public detail of memory map file.
Yeah.
Well, actually, like maybe I thought we were looking at the wrong one. There are two different create from files. One takes the file name, one takes the file stream.
Right, but once it takes a file stream, it turns it into a regular memory mapped file handle, and then the file stream is no longer exposed as a concept, correct?
Incorrect.
Right, like
no, it passes it straight through.
That's an implementation detail, though. It'd be very strange if the memory map file handle didn't map to the file stream.
I guess, yeah, that's a good point. Is what we wouldn't want it to take both the handle and the file stream, but we could take the arguments that are currently on the create from file that takes a file stream and make that be a constructor, so it can make sure that they're associated.
Sorry, which one are you talking about? I'm trying to follow along.
So there are two calls to that constructor. One is they're both methods called create from file. One takes a name and one takes a stream.
Yeah, and we have highlighted here the one that takes the name.
Right, and we should have looked at the one that takes the stream.
The one that takes the stream is here.
And
sorry, the one that takes the stream is already public.
Yeah. You're no longer sharing the screen, Levi.
The static method is public. This is because all the things that take an ACL reference are in a different assembly. Now we need to call across assembly, so things need to be made public, so we don't have to do internals visible to.
Yeah, correct. Because the alternative to solve this problem would be to use reflection, but I was told not to do that.
So now it's how do we make this method work in core, where we have a layering separation from the ACLs and the platform independent. And so I guess really it's hard because we can't, like, we need the ACL created in one place and the stream created in the other. So maybe the answer is we can't make this one work on core. Unless we can ask the handle, does this file stream and this handle actually belong together? But I mean, it does more validation.
Why do we need to take the file stream at all?
Right. So my answer is maybe we just don't. Maybe that method doesn't come.
Well, can we just ask the safe handle for the mapping and not the file stream?
That's what I'm asking.
The purpose of the file stream is so you can create the mapped handle on top of it, I assume, unless we're using it for some other reason.
The only reason we store the file stream is to clean it up.
Yeah, that's literally, it's used only by dispose. So, yeah.
So can we just take the mapped?
So do we want one that takes a handle and a disposable or an iDisposable for clean this up when you're done? It's a little weird.
Yeah.
Or figure out if there's a way to determine whether there's anything that needs to be closed from the mapped handle.
What happens if you close the mapped handle? I'm sorry, what happens if you close the file handle before you close the mapped handle?
I have no idea.
I'm not sure.
Seems like we should probably test that, because I can't imagine. I have to imagine the operating system handles that case correctly.
I mean, no matter, like, whatever it does is what it does. This is already. If you called the create from file with a file stream, you get the mapped handle, and then you call close on, or dispose on the file stream. Like, you're in that state. That's a public experience already. The question is how do we allow the transferring of ownership that we can currently get through that method when you say keep open false?
Can we make the memory mapped handle ref count the file handle? So that file stream.dispose wouldn't
we wouldn't be able to get back to the same safe handle. Like the only way that I can think of doing it is we have to pass something. It doesn't care that it's a file stream. It cares that it's a parent context that it needs to dispose when it disposes. And we need to get that in there somehow. Or we throw for leave open false.
I think someone should go off and prototype a whole bunch of options. It's not really worth talking about an API design review without implementation knowledge.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree. And then what I'm really curious about is what happens when the file stream's disposed, but the memory map handle's left open. Because if it's still usable, then nothing matters anymore. You would just pass in the handle and call it a day.
Okay, I can work on prototyping all these scenarios, and maybe we can schedule a separate meeting to discuss them. Okay.
Yeah. So no to the making that constructor public.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Let's see here. All right. Oh, needs work. No, it's. Oh, it was already marked needs work. Whatever. Good times. Okay. Next is Core Effects 40693. Add timespan dot infinite. Let's see here.
Didn't we do this before, and we marked it as needs more work?
Nope, doesn't look like we ever marked it needs work. Let's see here. Propose to add an alias under timespan, which is more discoverable. Oh, because right now it's on timeout. Surprisingly, there's a decent number of downvotes for this.
It's not surprising if you read the discussion.
Yeah.
As a person who downvoted it.
The problem with this API is that it's not actually an infinite time span. It's just -1 milliseconds. So
it's a sentinel. Yeah.
Yeah. It makes perfect sense on the timeout class, but on the time span class, I don't like it.
So it looks. Yeah. Sorry.
I think it's a case of it's generally an invalid input to most methods, and methods that take a timeout treat timeout dot infinite time span as an infinite timeout.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it. If anybody's already looking at a time span and they're asking, is it less than 0 and throw, like this value is already useless for them. And you can't just easily say wait forever. You have to look at it and compare it to see if it's the same. I agree with Steve. It doesn't make sense to be a number other than -1. And then I agree that it doesn't make any sense to be -1. So
yeah. It looks like there was a suggestion earlier in the thread, I think, from Steve, just to call it out clearly in the documentation that there is this other sentinel value on the timeout class itself. And that, honestly, that documentation should probably be referenced by each individual API that you're calling, rather than by the timespan class itself.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason that I would add one of these is to add it as obsolete true with go look here instead. But we shouldn't do that.
Okay, so is there a devil's advocate argument for actually adding this in? Because it sounds like we're all kind of circling, leave it on timeout, don't add an alias to the timespan class.
I think it would have been great to add 15 years ago.
Agreed.
I think it's too hard to add it now.
Yeah. If we were going to nuke and pave the whole world, that would be a time to do it. But
I think it's also time span itself isn't strictly speaking invalid to be negative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you have timespan.infinite, which is negative, and in some context, that time span would be a valid negative value.
Well, it's not just that, but users might use it assuming that it's just means an infinite time span when that's actually not a thing.
No.
Because you can add infinite to a time and you get another time. It's just in the past. Very
Yeah.
Okay. So basically saying that we don't want to add it because it's a Sentinel that has application only in very specific call sites. And we also don't want to special case -1 because -1 is a valid value for things that understand negative numbers. Okay. Timeout. So sounds like rejected with the justification written there then.
Yep.
Okay. Is there an actual
Nope, just the
rejected, just close button? Okay. Perfect. So that was CoreFX 40693. Because I don't have multiple screens, I have multiple laptops, so this is kind of fun. Now, it gives you a greater appreciation of how Emo gets to juggle everything during these reviews. Okay, CoreFX 40504. Tanner, take it away.
Basically, there's a common vector value, which is all bit set, which is commonly used for cases like masking, because it's used to say select all versus 0, which is select none. And this is a special case where we can optimize the creation of that value on various platforms to a single instruction rather than something like a broadcast or something else. And so the proposal is essentially we just expose another property alongside 0 called all bit set.
As opposed to 1, which is 1.
Right, because
Okay.
1 would be confusing as you don't know if it's like 1.0f for float and the literal integer 1 for integer types or something else. So all bit set was the name we came up with that was determined to be unambiguous.
Wasn't there an equivalent API on vector of t, unless I'm misremembering?
No, I think we've got vector of 1, which is slightly different.
So there's vector of t dot all ones.
That might be it, yes.
But it's internal though. It never got public.
Yeah.
But let's see here.
And I think all bit set is more ambiguous, or is less ambiguous,
Sure.
especially in the context of a vector.
Yeah, so I have shared on my screen the internal API. If we ever were to make this public, vector of t dot all ones, which presumably we would, then you're thinking this would be called all bit set as well?
Yes, because all ones could imply that each element is set to 1, for example.
Yeah, because vector 256 is always 256 bits, right?
Right.
So if you did vector 256 of byte, then what you're going to get is FF out of all the bytes, not 1 out of all the bytes. So I like all bit set. It's very descriptive.
Yeah.
Is it even for floats? It's still all bit set, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Which
Would
is what,
we
like negative infinity minus 2?
No, it's a negative nan.
Fair enough.
With an all bit set payload.
Should we go ahead and make this public at the same time with the appropriate name, just to get it out of the way, since it is basically the same thing?
Yes, so that one's a bit iffy. I would say yes, but the reason we might not want to is vector of t doesn't expose the same set of blending and other instructions that operate on masks that the intrinsics do. And so it might be we will expose it eventually, but only after we expose more APIs on vector of t that actually would take a mask.
Okay.
And users who do want to have an equivalent of all bit set today can use the conversion APIs we approved a couple months ago for converting from vector 256 to vector of t. So that they aren't blocked if they did have a scenario.
Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that at the same time we do this, we also rename the internal member. Just that way, if it ever does become public in the future, at least we'll have a consistent name.
That seems reasonable.
Okay. 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 Approved, ready for, so what was that, 40504? Okay. Was there anything else you wanted to say about that, Tanner?
No, I don't believe so.
All right, moving on. This is CoreFX 41131, execution context.run overloads. For some reason, I thought this was already approved. This was to avoid allocations, I believe, in the case where we're calling execution context.run. Yeah, because right now the only existing overload takes an object. Yes. Okay. And that forces anything to get boxed. Let's see here. So Steve already gave comments about that this should take in a ref rather than tstate directly. Okay, that's now reflected in the API proposal. Let's see here. Right, so one of Steve's earlier problems here is that it was duplicating a lot of code because it's in a really hot path. Are you still on the call, Steve?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Did you have any additional thoughts on whether you were still hesitant about code being copied into another method?
I wasn't hesitant about the two that he exposed. We already have it, or the one that he exposed. We already have it.
Yeah,
It's just internal. I was hesitant about adding yet another on top of that.
Was there? I somehow missed a discussion on adding yet another. Was there one?
David was asking to add one that takes a delegate, another different delegate signature.
But it looks like that.
We agreed not to.
Okay, so it looks like that may have just been removed from the proposal then. That's why I don't see it. Oh, yeah, it looks like the proposal doesn't include that anymore. Unless I'm missing something?
No, I don't think it was actually there. So he started with this, and then if you scroll down a little bit, David said he was also interested in one that takes a func. And I was saying
got it. Okay.
That's when the discussion sort of diverged to talk about that. And I was saying, I don't want to add that. You can do that on top of the other one.
Sure, that makes sense. Also, once we start talking about async, I would imagine that you probably have other thoughts on how execution context would flow that anyway, in a more optimal fashion.
But I have no problem with the one that we already have, just making it public.
Are there potential problems with source code breakage adding a ref overload to a non-ref overload? I don't think that's the case, but just
no,
people's brains.
It's only an issue if you try and overload on ref in and out.
Okay.
Object ampersand or object and semicolon tstate ampersand are completely unmatchable types. So the refness is a totally complete unique slot, except for the magic word in, which makes it look like it's not there, but the ampersand's still there.
Yeah.
I did a lot of playing recently with what happens if you add or remove refness and how bad does the runtime handle it.
Sure. Does as far as nullability goes, does the tstate parameter here, as I have highlighted, need a question mark on tstate? I'm not quite sure how that works with ref.
No. If someone wanted it to be nullable, they would declare tstate as a nullable type in their instantiation of it.
Oh, in the generic itself.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay. Sounds like there's no reason not to do it then.
I'm fine with it.
Okay.
I'm happy if Steve's happy.
We'll make that. Come on. There we go.
We should. The only question is there's some inconsistency in naming, which should be like, why is one called context and one's called execution context? But
sure, yeah.
We should just match whatever we currently have. I believe it's currently called execution context, so that's what it
should. Thank you for catching that. Okay. Perfect. No, that's good eye. Okay, moving on. Core effects, 41487. Oh no, this is mine. So one of the patterns that that I saw as somewhat common in both framework code and application code is calling string.split and then immediately trimming all of the entries that you get back from the split operation. Often this is for parsing comma separated values, where you could have a comma b or a comma space b. What I had proposed, and there are references to a bunch of different places in .NET where we do this. What I had proposed was adding another string split options, which automatically trimmed all of the strings coming back. So if you were to call string.split on doe comma space John, for instance, you would get doe and John as opposed to doe space John. And this would be a flags argument along with remove empty entries. So in this particular example, there's nothing between the 1 and the 2. So you don't get like 1 empty string 2, 3 as your return values. You just get 1, 2, and 3. This would.
I'm still saying, I don't know if everybody else is still saying. I'm not seeing the. Oh, now I do. I don't know if mine was just catching up. Sorry.
No, is the broadcast okay now?
I see it fine.
It was fine for me the whole time.
Yeah, and keep in mind, I'm also having some internet connectivity issues on my end, so don't be surprised if things just fail. And maybe even a power outage or two, who knows? So yeah, this could potentially be a breaking change because we are adding values to an enum. As far as I'm aware, we're the only entity that's ever supposed to be interpreting this enum. So in theory, adding values should be okay. But if you have a third-party library that's taking a string split options, and then someone passes in an unrecognized enum value, that library could throw an exception or have otherwise undefined behavior.
We generally, though, consider it okay to extend an enum with additional values, right? Isn't that considered an okay break?
As far as I know, I've never heard any hesitation to changing it before.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
And you explicitly say, like, we should do it as an enum. That way we can extend it in the future most of the time.
Yeah. The reason I brought that up is to be devil's advocate.
Fair enough.
Because I'm also biased because I had proposed this API. So feel free to tear it to shreds.
So we've got trim entries here. Should we have trim start, trim end, and trim entries be the combination of both for people who want to support either or?
You could. So one thing that would be kind of weird there is normally we would have trim entries be trim start or trim end, but we can't change the existing value of the enum, which means that you wouldn't be able to do a proper bitwise comparison on that flags anymore.
What do you mean?
So if you wanted to
you would make trim start.
If you wanted to
be
trim
2,
start and trim end. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Make trim start be 2, trim end be 4. You add an accelerator called trim entry, which is 6. Now everything works.
Oh, sorry, I'm derp. I was thinking remove empty entries. I'm sorry. My brain is not here today.
Yeah, I was thinking since string itself has trim start and trim end, as well as trim, and trim is just a combination of both. This is flags, so should we expose trim start, trim end, and trim, which is the combination of both?
Oh yeah, that would totally work. Sorry.
Are there? I mean, Levi, you went through a bunch of use cases. Did you ever see anyone using anything other than trim?
I did not know.
Yeah, I think trim's common.
It just feels
the most common.
It feels to me like there's a long tail of other things you might want to do, and including controlling what kinds of things you want to trim, not just is white space.
Yeah.
So we do have this separate API that lets you
trim
split a span, right? And it returns ranges, so a user could do the trimming themselves.
Yeah, these are all calls to trim. They're not trim start and trim end. Yeah.
It just feels like it might be over engineering.
Yeah, it was mostly a question of because if we do trim by itself today and we don't add trim start and trim end, then the set of valid flags that combine together might be confusing later.
Yeah, I think we would just decide now we're never going to add trim start and trim end.
I mean, we could just make this value 6 and then add those other ones in the future if we wanted to.
With a common thing that 2 and 4 are reserved.
Yeah, I mean, that makes it a bit difficult to do a bitwise comparison just of this, but.
Right. I think the answer is we decide right now we want trim start and trim end, or we decide we never want trim start and trim end. I don't think that there's, like, we don't, reserving is weird because effectively we've done the behavior. We should just do it if we make the value.
To be honest, I don't see a big scenario for it, just given how people historically have used these APIs. I could imagine that in really, really high performance use cases, you might only care about one direction or another, but in that case, we should really just be directing you to the span APIs.
Fair enough.
But now one of the questions would become like, would something like this make sense in the span-based APIs? Or would people just slice themselves because it's cheap to do that?
Yeah, I don't think it makes sense in the span APIs.
Yeah.
Don't the span APIs take one of these?
They do, yes.
In which case we would need to support.
Just for information, according to APIs of .NET, trim is called by 70% of things in API port telemetry, and trim start is called by 0.2% of things.
Yeah.
There's probably not really, like, I can't think of when I would want to ever trim start versus trim. Once I'm trimming, I assume that white space got leaked in somehow.
Well, trim start, you might want to remove zeros from a number or something like that.
Well,
yeah, but this does white space specifically.
Yeah.
And maybe a better name for this would be trim white space, because we're not giving you the option of trimming arbitrary characters from it.
Yeah, I would think the common case is you would use trim start for things like you read a line and you want to ignore leading white space, but you care about, for example, trailing new lines. And on the other end is you use trim end specifically because you just want to remove new lines from the end of it, for example. But other than that, I think trim's the common one.
Yeah, but then you were probably just splitting on new line already.
Potentially.
Yeah, you would never get them back as part of the original payload.
Yeah, I don't really see a big scenario for trim start and trim end here.
Yeah, and I also want to clarify, like, this isn't really meant for high performance, because again, if you really cared about that, you would probably be using non-allocating APIs. This is meant to make life easier. Yeah.
I mean, if
for
you
the
care
vast
about
majority of people who don't care.
If you care about perf, you're not using string split.
Oh yeah, of course. So.
Jeremy, it might be worth noting that you might have looked at the trim start with no parameters, which was only added in Net Core 2. The trim start, which takes a char array, which is the thing that exists in framework, where null is trim white space. That one's used in 41%.
Interesting. There was someone actually linking to this issue. What was this one?
Good catch, Tanner. Thanks.
Hmm.
I was ignoring the ones that took custom parameters because trim, like
Right.
the one at both ends, doesn't seem to take it. So
Yeah, but this is one of the cases where we went and added the empty and the car overload in 2.0.
well, I disagree with renaming it to trim white space, Levi.
No, okay.
Well, trim white space is ambiguous. Are you trimming the string before splitting, or are you trimming each individual entry? Like, if I like the fact that entries is in there because it's indicating that you're doing it on a per entry basis. If you want to work white space into that while keeping entry, that's fine. But I think then you're going to get a very long name that's not going to be much more descriptive.
And you
Trim
don't
white
just want to call it trim.
Well, because again, trim could be do trim before doing split instead of doing it on each individual entry.
Which, by the way, will give you the exact. Well, we'll give you
A different answer.
Sure. A different answer. Yes, you're right. You're right.
In particular, for the case where you have the white space but not completely empty entry of whether or not you see that entry when you've combined both flags, which I'm glad you pointed out because I was going to ask.
Yeah, I can't think of any cases aside from the ones that are written here as far as combinations go.
If you wanted to indicate it's just for white space, that would be trim white space from entries. But
sure, but that's a bit verbose.
Yeah. Like it really, what it is trim entries applies trim to each entry. Like that seems fairly unambiguous to me. But trim white space, there are two interpretations, and that bothers me.
Okay.
Other people can disagree with me, but that's my.
No, I agree.
Okay.
I agree.
So were there any arguments against doing this? And it sounds like we were probably a bit pessimistic on having trim start and trim end as separate entries, just because there's not really a big scenario for doing them individually.
Oh, I think due to the overload that takes no parameters only being added in net core, someone would have to go and look at how many use cases are calling trim start and passing, or are calling the one that takes a char array and just having it be the null. Because that's used in trim end is used in 40% and trim start's used in almost 50%.
Yeah.
In most cases. And if they're used that much, then there's likely a scenario where we should support it here as well.
Sure, I can take this offline, do some investigation for start and end, and then bring it back to review.
Sounds good. And then whatever you did to find all the places that were doing trim, there just to make sure that your filter wasn't specifically looking for trim. Like if you can try scanning again to see obvious split followed by trim start or split followed by trim end, that would be sure. Good data to confirm on.
Sure. Okay. So see if there's any usage of trim followed by derp. See if there's any usage of split followed by trim start and trim end as opposed to just trim. That'll inform us. So how's that? So I'll take that justification, kick it back to myself as needs work, and then come back to API review in the future with the information you're looking for. Sound good?
Cool.
Okay.
And like good value add.
Needs work. Okay, that was 41487. Okay. I have my OneNote on another machine that I'm typing all this into. 41783. This was we had a scenario where we actually wanted to generate null refs in C#, but the C# language doesn't allow you to have a ref to a null value. It's perfectly valid IL, and it's also perfectly type safe. So the fact that this proposal is going on the unsafe class, both to generate null references and to see if a reference is null, is kind of a bit interesting. But given that that's where all of our other ref APIs are, whatever. You can actually see a few places in the framework where we use these APIs, which are currently internal, in order to get performance gains. And if we're doing it internally, and if ECMASpec, or if ECMA 335 says it's valid, then there's really no reason we shouldn't be exposing this to our users as well.
Yeah, being able to get the null ref, certainly I've had p invokes that I've made ref for span and then found out that Cappy demanded null and not 0 in the length value.
Yeah.
So I've had to overload that to take byte array just so I could pass the null through. But so I can definitely see this being good for p invoke. I do like the get me the null ref being on unsafe because it's really hard. Like in C#, you can't really deal with it other than the is null ref question here. You try using it and then you die.
Yeah, exactly.
So making the getting one being on unsafe is good, and I can't think of a place to put the is other than next to the give me one. So that seems fine.
But
most people shouldn't care because most people shouldn't have one.
Yeah, and the thing is, we would keep them on unsafe even though they're safe.
Getting the null value of ref t is unsafe. That is super.
No, it's actually perfectly safe.
No, it's not, because you're going to pass it to something, and they're not going to ask if it's null, and they're going to write to it or read from it. It's completely.
Yeah, and then you get a null ref. The runtime actually has guarantees in ECMA 335 that this is a type safe operation. I didn't expect that at first, but it's actually part of ECMA.
Oh wait, so we null reference exception. We don't do. I guess that's how we handle, or because we turn the AV into null ref anyway. So yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just really weird that you took a ref int and you get a null reference. It's like where and
yeah, it's
the
completely counterintuitive.
It's unsafe in that it bypasses the default language semantics for most high-level languages, which is also true. What we've used for the unsafe class for. There are several things which are completely IL safe and completely verifiable, but because they bypass language semantics, we've said they are unsafe.
Yes, and this is verifiable, and that's what I should have clarified earlier.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for those are the words I was looking for, Tanner.
So it sounds like APIs like this, just like all the other APIs on the unsafe class, we just want to make sure have crazy good documentation on MSDN.
Yeah.
Are there any objections to this to adding this API?
Are there cases where we want to be able to return a read-only null ref without the user having to go through actually, I guess that's not a concern for null ref, but it's a concern for is null ref. Do we want to be able to check if a read-only ref is null without them having to go through unsafe as ref?
So we actually had a discussion on whether that first parameter should be in or ref, and one of the problems that came up was aliasing, and how you could inadvertently pass in something that you didn't intend to pass in because the compiler won't force you to use the in keyword. It's the description of that's in the middle of the screen if you wanted to read it.
The annoying part where
Go ahead, Jeremy.
I said it's the annoying thing where they made in be implicit on calls.
Right. But that's also not, strictly speaking, a bug. It's just a case where it will always return false. So it's basically a question of, do we want some cases where the user might get false because they passed in a temporary, which should only happen for RHS assignments, or do we want to force users who are working with read-only refs to require an additional call to unsafe as ref, passing in the in and getting a ref back out.
So if we were to take this as an in parameter, then I would want some kind of Roslyn analyzer or something that detects the case where you're making where you're implicitly generating a read-only reference to a local.
Errorprone.net says that.
Yeah, I was gonna say this seems like a thing that we could easily add an analyzer for. The compiler wrote a ref to a local here. You did this wrong.
I personally, as someone who uses ref and in fairly frequently for interop code and other cases, would much rather take in and have an analyzer warn me of the case that, you forgot to use in here, so you're passing in an R value, than have to add additional API calls to coerce the wrong way.
So then it sounds like the verdict would be tentatively approved, but we should also take the time to investigate what an analyzer rule would look like so that we could make this in the future and kind of hold people's hands so that they don't use it incorrectly.
I think that would be my vote.
Yeah, because the thing is, normally we don't hold your hand with calls to unsafe normally. So the fact that we would be introducing a rule for this one API is kind of an outlier.
It's not
this would
just
be the compiler
API,
warning. Go ahead, Tanner.
Oh, I was saying it's not just this one API though. There's a lot of cases where we are taking ref and it probably should be in, and it is very hard to go from a ref to an in, and going from an in to a ref, and doing so breaks safety that you would otherwise normally have.
And
for
in
example,
that
volatile read takes a ref, even though it never mutates the underlying reference, and the reason it does that is because we didn't have in way back in the day, but because it does that, if you actually have a read-only ref and you want to do a volatile read from it, you are put in the position of you have to add unsafe calls to make it happen, which not only makes the code less readable, but it makes it less maintainable, adds some level of confusion, et cetera, et cetera. It's basically a const cast.
Have you found in your own code that you're const casting away from in to ref for your scenarios?
Yeah, because if you want to do for example, unsafe add byte offset, you have to convert from an in to a ref to do that, because the APIs only take a ref, even though they don't mutate the in parameter.
The thing about that, though, is that's slightly different, because you would want those APIs to also return a ref read only as opposed to just a regular ref.
Sure.
Yeah, those would be overloads.
Yeah.
Alternate members.
Yeah.
But it's basically a case of you can go from ref to in, that's fine, but going from in to ref requires breaking language semantics.
Would you have some time, Tanner, to just like maybe find a short list, type it up of APIs that you think might benefit from going from ref to in? You had mentioned volatile, and
we
there are
can't
others.
make that change is the problem. It's a breaking change.
Yeah, it's a source.
You go from ref to in?
The compiler, you had to say the word ref to call the ref, and if you say the word ref, you can't call it in.
So I thought that was allowed.
No. So you can, if you compile with, for example, the C#6 compiler, which is not in aware, it is valid to call a method exposed as in using the ref keyword. But as soon as you move to a compiler that is in aware, it becomes a breaking change.
But in and ref
I've got an issue open against C#lang explaining this, and I believe Jared said that it would add too much complexity to overload resolution to fix today, and they probably should have done it back when they first introduced the feature.
And we can't have an overload where one takes an in and one takes a ref?
Right, because under the covers and IL, they're the same.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're both just T ampersand.
Interesting. So, and it sounds like the language team is never going to allow you to use ref to call an in overload?
They could, but it sounds like it would be non-trivial work in overload resolution to make it happen.
I see.
But maybe if we come up with enough scenarios, they would allow it. But that still wouldn't alleviate the concern raised here of you can pass an R value in to methods that take in. But I also think that's an analyzer concern rather than something that we should be designing APIs around.
Yeah, I mean, if this was going to be a super common thing, then I would have more hesitation. But I think that this is going to be niche enough that the analyzer could catch it. But I think having an analyzer for it is sensible. It's the same thing as when the compiler tried adding the, hey, you're comparing a value type to null. So we boxed it, or we turned it to nullable and then returned false for you. This isn't what you meant. Though I am aware they had to turn that one back off.
Sure.
But it's the same level of the code you wrote does not make sense. Please rewrite it.
So let me devil's advocate your argument then, Tanner. We have all of the other APIs on the unsafe class today, with the exception of asref, all take ref, not in. So having this take ref
added.
True. But is there benefit to having this match the refness of all the other overloads?
I don't believe so, because you can still pass a ref in here. You can take a ref and convert it to a ref read-only at no cost. The language allows it. You just can't go the other way. So if we expose this as ref, anyone who has an in and wants to check if it's null will have to they will have to use unsafe as ref in. So you're doubling the length of the line and adding confusion because you're removing the constness from the ref.
So both Jan and Vladimir are suggesting ref. Why are they wrong?
Because you can go from
if you're using this method, you're already using the unsafe class.
Right. But it's a question of, do you want most code to just work, or do you want users who have a read-only ref to have to go an additional step to call this API? And the only downside to taking in is that you can pass an R value in without using the in keyword, in which case this method will return false.
And it's inconsistent with everything else on the type.
Well, most of the APIs were added before in existed, so...
That's not really I mean, it's still inconsistent. Someone approaches it today, they see all the methods, and they were only added in the last, year and a half or something. This type is pretty new.
Right, but they were still added before in existed. And if in had existed, then I think I would have, at that time, I would have pushed for these ones aren't mutating the value, they should be in.
Maybe, but there's arguments being outlined here for why in is bad.
Which is only because you can pass in an R value.
And our guidelines are don't use in. So.
Well, for things like unsafe, I mean, we violate the guidelines everywhere just because they are intentionally allowing you to basically generate raw IL.
Indeed. So on the one level, my feeling is it should be in and we can write an analyzer for it, and not the 40 people who are ever going to use it are going to get it right most of the time. And they should be testing and cover when they didn't get it right. But I could also see a thing of, if we believe that the C# language is never going to fix the you can't change a ref to an in without breaking everyone, then if we were going to consider adding volatile.read from in or something, then maybe we would want the pointless alternative method just to use the word in here as well. So I would go both ways. From a technical purity, it really should be in.
So Steve, if we were to ship a Roslyn analyzer, would it be part of the same package that is compiler services unsafe? Where does it live?
So our tentative plan right now is to have a set of analyzers that basically ship as part of the SDK, but they would be anything that ships there and is on by default would have to have as close to 0 false positives and basically no noise in a noise to signal ratio as you could possibly imagine, because it'd be on for everyone all the time. So basically 0 false positives.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But passing an R value here is always a mistake because it'll always report false.
Correct.
So this would be a good candidate for that term.
I don't know. It feels I'm hesitant to ship an API that we then immediately know we didn't analyzer for because someone's going to get it wrong.
What I would almost want to do is just have an online conversation also with Vladimir, because it sounds like he was giving additional reasons beyond just R values as to why this might be ill-advised.
Well, aliasing shouldn't be a problem for this, right?
Not for this, correct. For other APIs, it definitely has been an issue, but for this, it shouldn't matter. Okay, so how about this? I will punt this back to myself, and I'll have a sit down with you, Tanner, and some other folks from the language team, and just hash out what the potential problems might be and how we might be able to address those problems, either in an analyzer or with language syntax changes. Does that seem reasonable?
That seems reasonable.
Okay. Okay.
There have been a few issues where we've talked about having analyzers. Have we actually tracked getting analyzers created for those, or are we just leaving it to some future? It just seems like an easy scapegoat.
We have an issue of all the analyzers that we have talked about, or all the analyzers that are sort of known to be on the list to be considered for .NET 5. I do not know if that is complete with every analyzer that people have talked about here. I would suggest go and look at the list and see if anything's missing.
I believe the one for you're passing an R value to an in parameter is covered there. And right now we're telling people to use errorprone.net.
Okay. Yeah, but our answer can't be use a third-party tool to write code, though. But sure. Okay. Next. Jeremy. This is CoreFX 42372. Jeremy, would you be able to talk to this or what?
Sure. So right now, I guess there are two problems. One is because symmetric cryptography was written using an interface, we have no way to spanify it, or at least no good way to spanify it. And another is everybody, it takes a lot of code to kind of do it right, and everybody kind of gets it wrong on their first 6 attempts. And so what most people want to do is I have some data, I want to encrypt it. And so we're saying, how about on symmetric algorithms, so on AES and triple DES, et cetera, that you just get an instance method of let's go encrypt some data. And then this also sort of gets rid of the fact that a property controls a mode that most people don't understand, and then when they set the mode, they don't understand what properties are relevant. So this is kind of do cryptography the way it should have been done in the first place, as a retrofit. So this is essentially just going off of Buffer's guidance. The basic thing is we have try encrypt and then a mode, and then the arguments that it takes, try decrypt in a mode and the arguments it takes, and then the we'll just do it for you, and then we'll return an answer for you. And so it's each one is just all his groupings here are just flavors of the same thing.
So the try methods, what are the failure cases there? Destination buffer too small, bad padding?
So if by failure you mean return false,
Yes.
a buffer accepting try method is only allowed to return false if destination is too small. It must throw in all other cases. So bad padding is
Well, bad padding could potentially return false, not throw.
bad. Well, cracked padding.
Yeah.
It's like if you've mutated and the padding byte turns into a 1 when the correct padding was 7, like that could be false, but you've produced a legal corrupted message.
Okay, true.
If the padding is legitimately 1 and you only gave enough space to hold where padding needed to be 2 or more, then you'll get false. Because the destination is not big enough.
Got it. I think Corey, were you saying something? Sorry.
Oh, I'm just curious. Is ECB common in use still? And do we want to make it easier to use it?
So ECB, every time any new mode is written, it is written in terms of ECB. So
yeah,
if you're using a mode we don't support and or if there's a mode we don't support and you're trying to do it, then ECB is the only way to do it.
Okay. Yeah, ECB. Think of ECB as like the 0 mode that everything can be written on top of. Ish.
Yeah.
And we use it in, I think, exactly one place in ASP.NET as well. So.
Okay.
So like you could write AES-CTR right now, which we don't have, but we'll probably have for 5, even though it'll be an argument with CryptoBoard. But the like you could write CTR in terms of ECB or X, whatever BitLocker uses. X something.
So how does this work then? So none of these APIs are taking the key. So it's assumed that the algorithm itself has been instantiated with some specific key.
Right. So this is using the key property.
Yeah.
If the padding modes are default, because the padding mode default is actually an invalid value, if the padding mode is default, then it will use the property. Otherwise, it will use the parameter.
Sorry, say that again. Sorry.
So the padding mode for CBC, or I guess the padding mode for all the non-stream modes, is a default parameter. The default value is itself an illegal value. Therefore, we can detect the default value and then say we will defer to the property.
Do you have a padding mode enum here, or does one exist? Oh, one exists, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Let's see here.
It's the thing that is currently the property.
So none. Okay, got it.
But encrypting with no padding and
none is 1, not 0. Oh god.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I guess none actually isn't invalid.
Great.
That's just different.
Okay.
I mean, we can default it to -1. It's a default. No one cares.
I mean, should it not just be defaulted?
We don't have a 0 value.
Yeah.
The 0 value is illegal. Yes.
Why shouldn't it just be defaulted to PKCS7, or is it because you want it to be very explicit?
Because if people start switching to it after using the property, given that they already don't understand padding modes, it seemed easier to say 0 is use the property.
Why not just make it not default? Why not just make it required? If the default value is illegal.
Well, the default value means that we have a sentinel that we understand means go read the property.
Oh, got it. Okay.
So, yeah. So default is 0. If 0 is passed, that instead of throwing, we say we'll turn it into the property instead.
Oh, right. You're reusing the existing symmetric algorithm class. You're not introducing another hierarchy. Okay.
Right. So the key comes from the class already. The padding mode and the block mode and stuff are already on the class, but these methods clearly ignore the block mode because it's in the name.
Block's part of the name. Yeah.
We're going to ignore the IV property altogether because everybody gets that wrong. And so IV is a required property, but padding mode, since you almost always just want the default, we defaulted that one.
So
We could also default it to PKCS7 if you think that's a better explicit thing.
how does this work if you have multiple threads calling this simultaneously? Because right now on the symmetric, algorithm class, you can call create encryptor or create decryptor from multiple threads simultaneously, and we make kind of pseudo type safety guarantees.
Yeah. I mean, the default virtual implementation, that's what it's going to do.
But it would have to set properties like padding mode or block mode before it calls create encryptor, which means you could be mutating the state of the object.
Yeah, that's fair.
Or we just say these APIs aren't thread safe, even though the
turns
other
out,
ones are.
Calling instance methods on a type on multiple threads is not a safe operation.
Yeah, but the symmetric algorithm class, we've generally made exceptions for in full framework, and I think those exceptions also propagated
I've
to
never
core.
told anyone it was thread safe. I've told them explicitly it's not.
Yeah, a lot of customers, including all of ASP.NET, relies on it being thread safe. It's one of those things it's once all the properties are set, it's thread safe for consumption is kind of the pattern we followed with it.
Yeah, alternatively, we make all the new things throw. And then they're responsible for dealing with their own maintain thread safe read.
So this pattern of ignoring or overriding some properties is kind of weird to me. Have you considered making this just a completely separate class?
Yes, but that would be painful. Like if we start that, we throw away the entire crypto space and start over, which would be great in many ways, but is very difficult.
Yeah, because I had kind of thrown that out there just as a like symmetric algorithm too, but it's painful. It's very, very painful.
Yeah, it's just we're calling these easy APIs, but they kind of come with some caveats also.
Yeah, I mean, like we can completely skip the part where it reads the property for the padding mode and that it's now a required parameter or a parameter defaulted to PKCS7.
Yeah. Oh man. What is, by the way, the default implementation of these methods?
Well, like the default was going to be called create encryptor, but you pointed out changing the property for thread safety, so the default's now throw.
Well, it would have to change the property anyway before it calls create encryptor, correct?
If it was going to call create encryptor, yes, but if you believe that there's enough basis of, I mean, like all of our types would get it right.
Yeah,
we're going to overwrite it. So the question is, do we push failure onto the like 3 people who may have extended this type? And if the answer is no, then it's protected throw or protected virtual throw. Which is fine.
Oh man.
I mean, alternatively, you can do something super dangerous and lock this, but that's still not really safe with interacting with other or with anybody calling create encryptor, unless it also does lock this. But
question about decrypting CBC. Is this intended to be the entire buffer or a partial buffer to be decrypted?
I mean, if you don't process padding, then you do whatever you want. If you pass with a padding mode, then if the padding doesn't work out, it doesn't work out.
So if the caller is calling this API, then
the expectation is it's always one shot. If they learn that they can do it without being one shot, then that's on them.
Okay. So it's intended that they pass the entire buffer and then the correct padding mode.
Ciphertext must be a multiple of the block size.
Yep. Okay.
Yes, these are.
No, what? Yeah. What
one
I
shot-
really meant was should this API try to depad it or not? And it sounds like
Yes.
the caller is responsible for providing that. Okay. Okay.
I mean, this is the protected, so it comes from one of the
Yeah.
other ones. We can also say that the core method here that we should flip the out in the padding mode because the padding mode is no longer defaulted.
Sure.
I don't think that we've seen a case yet where this has come up.
So I can be convinced that thread safety actually isn't a huge issue here, because I can't imagine a scenario where somebody would create a symmetric algorithm and then using the exact same key and then call multiple different encrypt or decrypt methods saying sometimes I want CBC, sometimes I want ECB, and so on. Like, that's just setting yourself up for disaster at that point. So okay, so I'll rescind my my protests there. But you were suggesting that the default implementation then would just be set the properties, call create encryptor or decryptor, and go?
Yep.
It seems reasonable.
And
That
then
also
they can
means
even
our
do
default.
fancy stuff of if it says it can't handle multiple blocks, do crypto stream and drain it through that, and etc.
Sure.
Not that any of our encryptors say they can't handle multiple blocks, but still.
And within our algorithms, like anything that's backed by bcrypt, really, like we could actually make all of these faster if we really wanted to.
Yeah, we're gonna we will override this in all of our types.
Yeah.
And we'll do them in the one shot that you would get if you called create encryptor, create decryptor, and then transform. You call that one and give it all the data in one go, which is honestly, it's the only thing I ever do anymore because I know that the answer is they all support multiple blocks. But
Sure.
I don't tell people they can rely on that.
Okay, so you have an API here, which is get the length of the ciphertext from the length of the plain text. Do you want an API which is given the entire ciphertext buffer, get me the length of what it would decrypt to, given a padding mode, or is that just
the answer is you
making
can't
it do
know.
too much work?
You have
I mean,
to
not without decrypting it, right?
You can get the minimum and maximum, but
Yeah.
you can't. That one's otherwise difficult.
It is. I mean, you need to do a lot of work to calculate that number. Yeah.
Well, you have to decrypt it.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can't do it just on links, but you can get bounds based on links. Which
Okay.
is, all the way up to the end for stream ciphers, and then up to minus a block for block ciphers.
So why do we want the get me the encrypted bytes API if we don't have a decrypted one, just because we can give you the answer in O1?
Yeah, and it's the only one that's bigger. For decrypted, if you always pass in ciphertext, if you have a plain text buffer that's as big as a ciphertext buffer, it always works.
Okay.
So there's an implicit upper bound of ciphertext.length for plain text.length.
And that is non-virtual, so we do all the math ourselves. Okay. Which makes sense, because we can do it just from the block size of the algorithm.
Yep.
Okay. I have no other complaints.
I mean,
anyone else?
I'd say the one unresolved question is the default value for padding mode. Corey thought it was a little weird that default meant read the property.
Well, it's not just that, but it's also that you have the block mode just implicitly getting set on the base class. So,
well, that's only on types that we don't provide, or rather, only on types that don't override the core members.
Yeah. Given that we explicitly force you to pass the IV and we don't use the IV from the actual symmetric algorithm itself, I would almost be tempted to say, like, force them to set the padding mode as well. Or default it. I mean, if it's CBC, default it to PKCS7. Just because, yes.
All right. So your thought is CBC default it to 7 and ECB make it explicit?
Possibly, yeah. because I don't know what a default would be for ECB, honestly.
Well, I'm fine making ECB harder.
Yeah.
But we need to make it doable. And then
yeah, because if you're using ECB as a building block because you really shouldn't be using it on its own, then you're probably passing in some padding mode that you're aware of. Yeah. Okay.
And then if we add CTR or anything else, then that'll be that wouldn't take a padding mode because those don't make sense.
Yeah. So would we actually add things like CTS to this in the future?
I mean, the problem with CTS is it means 3 different things, so we need to decide how we want to distinguish the 3 different ciphertext sealing algorithms. But yes.
Okay. Okay, because the reason I ask is because it is the other mode that is approved by CryptoBoard.
Right. Yeah, they approved one of the CTSs.
Yeah, I need to look up the details,
right.
But
yeah. We don't use we never ask the systems to do the padding. We always do it ourselves.
Okay.
It's easy enough to add.
Sure.
All right. So decrypt CBC default or padding mode default to 7. Decrypt ECB, make it explicit, and then on the core ones, should we flip the padding modes to be before the outs?
Sorry, what was that last?
On all the core,
yeah,
the padding modes aren't optional anymore, so they should
outs should go at the end. Okay.
And did we decide if the default would throw or call the implementation?
The default could probably just call the implementation. I think my problem with thread safety was probably a bit too strict, and I don't really see a problem in hindsight. Just because I don't see anybody using different modes of operation using the same key on the same symmetric algorithm instance.
A third suggestion or a third potential thing is ignoring the possibility of race condition because it's not a thread safe type. We say that the default implementation will throw if you call a mode that's not the one that's set in the property. It refuses to change the value, but if it's right, it will use it.
And the default, I think, is CBC.
The default implementation is for CBC is going to take your IV that you give and call to array because it needs to pass it as an array into the creating crypto overload.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the behavior of these methods would be different. The observable behavior would be different with our implementation versus some custom implementation then, because our implementation would not end up setting the IV property and all of that, but the default
we'll never set the IV property.
There is, to your question, Corey, there is a create encryptor method that all symmetric algorithm classes have. In fact, it's abstract. You have to override it. The key and IV are passed in there explicitly, so you can do that without needing to set the key or IV properties.
Okay, awesome.
But that's what we would call under the covers.
Yeah, the only one that we would have to set would be the mode, and we can throw if the mode's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I'm good then.
Yeah,
And no one, aside from our tests, will ever see that exception because they'd have to be, someone would have to be calling the new methods using a type that's not a type that we wrote and not having already set it's possible, but it's never going to happen.
Okay.
But if we can do that for maximum, don't change the mode in case someone cared or thought that it was thread safe. So.
Okay.
All right. And then basically this will just be the pattern for as we add new modes in the future.
Yeah. So I wouldn't let that stop us from approving the API. It's just, at that point, it's a doc issue. Any concerns with that?
Right. And then for ECB, we'll have to move some parameter orderings when we undefault the parameter, but that's fine. That's just part
Yeah.
of the no undefault the parameter. So.
There. So move non-out parameters before out parameters, sure. Okay. So I would say that is a clever way for me to spell approved. There we go. Next. Next, Core Effects 38395. What is this? I've actually not seen this before. So straight to the API. Okay. So sorted dictionary, they want to add constructors that take an read-only dictionary. Same with sorted list. Let's see what they have right now because I don't see an existing API.
It takes an iDictionary. We can't do it because it'll be ambiguous constructor invocation.
That's too bad. And sorted list is the same. Yeah.
Yep. We could do it as new methods, but we can't overload the constructor. We really need the language feature of if you're down to an ambiguous set, this one wins.
So interestingly enough, iDictionary does not implement iRead-only dictionary.
No, but dictionary implements both. We added iRead-only dictionary later, and we can't add a new base interface because if someone implemented it explicitly, or you move, or yeah, then it messes everything up.
And we can't. I thought that the whole like default interface feature was supposed to allow us to make those changes.
We've never used it, and I don't know that we ever will.
So the problem is passing in a dictionary of T key T value would fail at this point.
Right, because both constructors are valid targets. Neither is an explicit match, and then you're forced to cast it.
And what if we added yet another constructor that took explicitly a dictionary of T key T value?
It would still fail for anybody who had any other type that was both iDictionary and iRead-only dictionary.
That is
the 99% case, but we'd still be a source breaking change, and we'd still we've said no to things like this before.
Yeah.
So we would need a new member at this, or we need a new method group, which means it has to be a static factory instead of a constructor overload.
Let's see here. So it sounds like, well, in the scenario here, the user has a class that implements iRead-only dictionary instead of iDictionary because clearly they can't call the original constructor.
Right.
Right, but it still breaks anyone who implements both.
What if we did something like an extension method on iRead-only dictionary? To sorted dictionary or to sorted list.
That seems really weird because you're coupling things backwards. Like, why, when you have an iRead-only dictionary, does it all of a sudden show that there's a to sorted dictionary?
Same reason that we have on IEnumerable and iList a .toList method as an extension method. It's a way to conveniently wrap an existing collection inside of a new list of T specifically.
Yeah, but list is a very, very, very common use type. I don't know that sorted dictionary is. Like, it's not a thing. I don't think it would meet criteria for extension method. It's not. It doesn't have enough utility to the noise it adds to IntelliSense.
Let's see here. I'm just trying to think of any possible way we could do this without introducing a break.
I mean, again, it has to be a new member. Once it's a new member, who cares if it's sorted dictionary.create or an extension method? Sorted dictionary.create is better because of layering.
It is, yeah. I mean, it hurts subclassing at that point, but maybe that's not a huge issue.
Is sorted dictionary unsealed? Yes, it is unsealed.
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean,
damn.
you have a sub-sorted dictionary, you can. Yeah, I don't know.
I guess one other thing is make a constructor that takes iRead-only dictionary that has a different arity than the other constructors. That way it can never conflict. But we would literally be introducing an unused parameter for the sake of introducing an unused parameter, which is a bit weird. Maybe it's just not an important enough scenario then.
Sorted dictionary currently does not have an add range, which is the common drain one thing into another.
Yeah.
So if we add range, we can overload that one to our heart's content because it's new. So add range could take an iRead-only dictionary and maybe an IEnumerable. The problem is if you do that again, you cut everything off. You have to.
Well, you could create a sorted dictionary with the comparer of your choice, and then call add range on your iRead-only dictionary. Yeah.
Right, but if your iRead-only dictionary is also IEnumerable of KVP, then if we add add range overloads, you have to cast to call it, which means we've solved the problem of not having a compile breaking change. We just have an ugly to call method.
Okay, so maybe we just punt this as we can't do it due to the signatures end of the constructor.
Well, the dictionary one is, I mean, we can decide that we only care about IEnumerable of key value pair, and we could add the add range.
And we could special case iRead-only dictionary or whatever inside of it if we wanted to.
Yeah, we could add it and we could specialize it, but we can't overload the existing constructor. So it could be an add range that takes the enumerable. On all the other things which don't have like an in level of interface problem, theoretically that's just the IEnumerable.
Sure.
And so all of those seem like things that are reasonable add range. We just can't solve it with a constructor overload because of ambiguity. But
okay,
that would really, it's bounce it back for somebody who needs to prove that they can make it all work.
Oh man, I think I got that correct. IEnumerable of key value pair T key T value. So let's see here. iRead-only dictionary T key T value. My dict equals get dictionary. Sorted dictionary news. Comparer, sorted dictionary.
iRead-only dictionary itself extends IEnumerable of key value pair up to key to value. So that one add range would cover all of the modes.
It would, and we can do the same thing that Link does. We can special case individual types in there if we have to in order to get performance back.
Yeah, I mean, we can as it out if we think that there's a more optimal implementation.
So the constructor, instead of being a one-line constructor, the constructor is really 2 lines. Create the thing and then populate it.
Yep.
And if you're looking to make it more efficient, you'd likely want to pass the count into sorted dictionary. That way it's sized correctly initially.
Sure. Okay, so how's that? So I'll punt it. So I'll punt it with this question back to the original poster, and we'll see if maybe that would work for their scenarios. So I'll mark this as needs work and then wait for a response. Sure.
Yep.
Okay. All right. That was, let me make sure I have that written down. That was 38395. Okay. This is runtime 1210. Let's see here. And this is talking about missing constructors on object disposed exception. So it looks like object disposed exception does not have, from this description, all of the different constructors that we would expect from an exception type. Object name, message, inner exception. Oh yeah, the longest constructor, which would be object name and message, is missing the inner exception. Okay, sure. Let's see here. Come on. Amo. Amo's not here and still somehow he's slowing us down. There we go. Object disposed exception. I see. So to Corey's point, like, what would the inner exception even be here?
Yeah, like that. I was thinking that of, usually it's just if I'm disposed, throw new object disposed exception. Like,
Yeah.
why are you wrapping something?
The only reason I could see to add this is that we already have an inner exception constructor, so just for consistency purposes. But yeah, I don't know why one would ever call this.
Yeah, I mean, it does, adding it does make it match pretty much every other exception type we have.
But we've not
So-
needed it for 15 years, so why do we need it now?
Exactly. Can we see how, if the constructor taking an inner exception is ever being called?
2.5%. Let me see. Object disposed exception. Inner exception. So no one's calling that. That makes sense. Let's check reference source. This one. Oh man. I don't really know what's going on here. Exception for known code. Oh, so they're getting back effectively an H result, turning it into an object disposed exception, and then, yeah.
Track
So the scenario that was mentioned earlier.
So the inner exception is likely an external exception.
Yeah. I mean, it's the generalized scenario for any inner exception, really. I don't see a compelling reason not to do it. That's the thing. Like, it is the exception pattern.
Kind of. I mean, the exception pattern, it's already covered there. There's one that takes a message and an inner exception. That's the pattern. This is adding one that takes that and this other piece of state. Not that I'm against it, but
Sure.
The core constructors are there.
Okay, that's fair. I guess I was thinking that there would be exception object specific data, in this case, the object name and the message, and then the inner exception after that, because that's kind of the base thing.
I mean, this is already weird in that second constructor that's there, you would really expect that to be message. The fact that it's object name is a little confusing.
Oh, this is weird. Object name here, and then message inner exception here. That's truly bizarre.
That's probably because we do the same thing in most of the other exceptions, like argument out of range exception. The default is you take a param name, and then you always also expose the message inner exception overload.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like
So-
it's technically fine, and I guess if we already have the other ones, then it's good to. I don't know what state you're in when you need it, but the problem is going to be like with argument exception, like the real base class argument exception of the string comma exception is not the one you want.
Yeah.
It's worth calling out that there isn't an argument out of range exception overload that takes param name, message, and inner exception.
Yeah.
And that is likely way more common than object disposed exception.
So let me go to that real fast. That is argument null exception.
Argument out of range.
Is this the weird one where the constructor parameters are out of order? So param name.
No, that's the base
param
class.
message. Okay.
Argument exception is the one with param name as the later parameter.
Yeah.
So let's punt this back then with a message asking like, do you actually need this? Because in their case, they're just subclassing it, presumably for their own purposes, but they could introduce the missing parameter at their level, and then just fill in the dots as needed.
Maybe. I
Well,
don't
they
remember
can't set
how
the
many of these
object
things are assignable
property.
after the constructor.
Let's see here. So object name they could fill in, message they could override, but they won't be able to flow the inner exception down, will they? Because the inner exception is not virtual. Is that correct? System exception, yes. Right, so inner exception is not virtual, so they can't do that.
And the field is read only, so it has to have been assigned to the constructor.
Yeah. This is the only thing they could override from their subclass type if they wanted to.
Which would not necessarily serialize right if they cared about app domains.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, like the real question is if he's subclassing it, and this is just the hey, while subclassing it, I realized something weird. Like this feels like a wart. Really, the question is, what's the scenario?
Yeah.
Because you shouldn't find out via some other exception that you're in a disposed state. Generally, like I can't think of when that would be something we would call correct behavior.
I think the only case you would see that is likely interop code, where the native side may be managing its own state first.
It's curious how you would get that error from your native code. You've already disposed whatever the native is operating on, right?
Yeah, that because if you are if the managed type exposes the handle and someone closed the handle and then the native side is objecting to that, then that would be invalid operation exception. You've corrupted the state of the object. That's not I'm disposed because you didn't call dispose, obviously. And if you did,
Right, but it can still be
that
functionally disposed.
So they tried to subclass object disposed exception. Would we just say why not match the constructors that object disposed exception has?
Right, like I think that this is. I assume that the question here is purity, and if it's just purity, then I don't
Yeah.
think there's a scenario, and I don't know that we would add it. If there's a scenario that we're not understanding, then it's not hard. It's just weird. Like,
Yeah. Okay, so I'll punt it back to them then, just asking like, hey, can you clarify the scenario? Like, what are we actually missing here?
Because every ODE that I can ever think of is either you have a Boolean called disposed, or you're using the state of like the nullness, or it is closed on a safe handle or something. Like you always, know it, you're never inferring it.
Yeah. Let's see here.
The only thing I can think of that maybe you would do it is if you're wrapping an object exposed exception with a higher level object exposed exception, but that just means you missed the Boolean. Like you should have had the Boolean. You shouldn't have called the thing that you disposed.
Okay, so I've punted it back with a message saying like, hey, we need more information on what you're actually blocked from doing. I actually didn't have any other. We have 10 minutes left, but I didn't have any other tabs open of stuff to cover. We could find one.
There's a small one. It's not API approved, or it's not strictly speaking an API review issue. It's it's another one of these, should we mark these methods as read-only or not? Specifically for nullable of T, we had previously tried to mark the struct as read-only, and we couldn't because it's a breaking change.
What's the number?
I'm just pulling that up now.
Or feel free to share yourself if you want to.
It is sorry, GitHub's being slow.
Yep. Nope. Whenever you pull it up.
836 on runtime.
836.
Yeah. They're just requesting that we mark value and has value as read only.
Nullable of T we can't.
No. This isn't marking the entire method. This is marking the entire struct. This is marking individual members as read only, which do not mutate and can't because they're just reading a field rather than calling an instance member on that field.
Let's see here.
Because
we previously tried toString, but toString was a problem.
toString was the problem. Yeah, I think marking value and has value as read only is valuable.
Why would we mark has value as read only?
Because it doesn't mutate.
Yeah.
And so basically,
optimization that we get for that.
Right. So basically, if you have a read-only nullable, so like public or private static read-only int $? Equals 5, and you call has value on that read-only field, it will create a private hidden copy today because the compiler can't know that has value doesn't mutate. Marking it as read-only tells the compiler this doesn't mutate, which allows you to avoid the copy.
And get value or default would presumably be the same.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah. It's only the methods that mutate the underlying instance or could, such as toString, since it calls value.toString, which we can't mark as read-only, which is why we had to revert it on the entire struct.
Yes. Yes, this makes sense. Because one of the other things that I had brought up in a separate issue was, does it ever make sense to have a getter that returns ref read only of the value itself? Because I know, like Jeremy, that would have made some of the stuff that you were working on a little bit easier, probably. But whatever. Because this is still going to return a copy of the value. It's just not going to make a copy of the nullable of T before it returns a copy of the value.
Right. So has value, both get value or default should be fine. Equals, get hash code, and toString are not.
Correct.
Am I remembering incorrectly that the Roslyn actually special cases nullable of T for all this?
No, the compiler doesn't special case it for read-onliness.
You sure?
I'm almost positive. Let me check on Sharp Lab.
Oh, I guess we're doing this together.
Yeah.
See who gets it first.
Yeah. Yeah, this is making a copy instead of loading a reference to the parameter.
So what if you change it to ref instead of in? You're saying it would change?
No, that's so load arg call ret. Load arg call ret.
Right. So there was an extra
address. Oh no, it is going by. You're right. It is going by the address.
Right.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
Apparently, we did special case this one. What if you call get value or default? Like maybe they only did it on the properties. But yeah, the toString was very different there.
Yeah.
That was load arg call, and then if you call the toString, it got much longer. Return like toString.length. You're still an int.
Yeah.
So the compiler's doing it, but we've not documented that behavior in the API service.
Yeah. So
this is clearly making a copy of the type or of the in question mark.
Right, and that's not going to change if we add attributes to has value or read only attribution to read only or to has value and value.
Yeah.
Right. That would only.
We've effectively done it, but
right.
only for the Roslyn compiler.
Right. So my point is,
we should do it at the.
We
API
can do it.
It's
then. Just not actually the reason for doing it isn't that it improves performance. It's consistency or documentation or something.
It'll make analyzers like any sort of analyzer, unless they've done it before the analyzer layer. Like they might flag like, hey, you're calling a non-read-only method. It's like, well, sort of.
Yeah. Or other languages, for example, would be the other scenario.
Yeah.
Or the next time that they start rewriting a compiler, then they forget that this was supposed to be special cased.
Well, I'm sure Roslyn would appreciate being able to remove some code. So
they won't, because it'll only be this in new targeting packs.
True.
So it looks like those three particular methods we want to have read-only: get value, get has value, get value or default.
Yeah.
Okay. And this wouldn't be for performance because Roslyn already does the right thing. It would be to make the API surface match what the compiler is already emitting.
That looks to be the case, yes.
Yep.
Okay. Any objections?
It's good.
Good by me.
All right. And with that, if somebody can go ahead and hit save on the video, we will shut this down. Thank you, everybody. Much appreciate you taking, the time out of this snowy morning.